Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
One thing we haven't specifically really said yet, but which is part of all this, is the wilderness ideal,
Right.
because that came out of that whole time. And the wilderness ideal, which is very much with us now, in a particular form, is this idea that land is natural when there aren't humans on it,
Right.
when there aren't people on it, and when it comes to the ecosystems of what's now the United States, this is completely ahistorical, because all of the ecosystems of the United States, where you are in Pennsylvania, on the West Coast, the Great Plains where I grew up, all of those ecosystems are new since the last glaciation period, right? So all of them started to form 11 or 12,000 years ago, but really weren't getting to a stage where we would recognize them now until 8 or even only 6,000 years ago. And human beings were here that entire time, because human beings have been here for at least 30,000 years, and some say 130,000. So in other words, as the ecosystems that we call native and refer to as native were forming, human beings were there the entire time as some sort of formative element. And we almost never put it this way, but in these landscapes, Homo sapiens is a native species.
Right, we're a keystone species. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that gets left out. That's why they were able to kick all the Indians out of Yosemite and all the other national parks, where they did, et cetera. But this idea that like the only way to take care of nature is to keep us out of it, I still see that one all the time,
Right.
And
yeah, well, it's still happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that applies to any of the plants that came with us or something like that,
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fortress conservation, right?
Right.
So fortress conservation is this idea that you build a fortress around what needs to be preserved. And that if we can do that, somehow we can preserve biodiversity in a way that preserved fortress will be able to support all of the land around it. That doesn't work. Like, that does not work. You can't take little pockets of the planet and preserve it and say that that's enough to sustain the things outside of it. It doesn't work that way. We know it doesn't work that way. I don't know why we're continuing to do this. Like, when I say, like, we're continuing to create more fortress conservation districts. We're creating more, and particularly in places like South America, like Africa. We're seeing there's a book called Conservation Refugees, which, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend. And it's talking about this. Briefly talks about Yosemite as the model for the current application of fortress conservation all around the world, and what that looks like, and how the silver lining, the kind of slightly happy ending of that, is that there are some changes, very, very small changes that are, in my mind, they're not nearly big enough to recognize and acknowledge that the indigenous people that have been on those lands for, thousands of years in many cases, are the reason why that place is worth conserving. It's the reason why we say this particular area is so biodiverse that we're going to conserve it and make it a park. We're going to push the people off of it, and then they're going to have to go and assimilate and get wage labor jobs. And then when they try to come back to their homelands and gather herbs or hunt or something, we're going to criminalize them and call them poachers and thieves. And some of them are they're actually putting them into concentration camps. So this is still happening today. And it's happening because because conservation is frequently being driven by what are called bingos, or BINGOs, right? So basically industry pushing into these spaces. No, I don't think it's happening 100% of the time. I do think there are cases where conservation they're trying to preserve what they believe to be these biodiverse hotspots. But you can't create, like I always say, you can't quarantine nature, right? That doesn't work that way. You need to find a way to support whoever is living on the land from that landscape. And we probably don't have time to get into talking about like how that works in an urban environment. There is a little bit of separation that's happening there, but even those environments we need to start paying a lot more attention to because they're still growing. So we have to stop. We have to get out of this mindset that in order to protect nature, we need to separate from it, because otherwise, not only are we doing more harm than good to the nature itself, because humans are the ones that created the environment for a lot of the places that we want to preserve, but also because we as a species cannot continue to live on a planet that we don't integrate into. Like we can't continue to produce food and materials, and all of these things. We can't continue to do it we certainly can't maintain the level of consumption. I think a lot of people are coming to terms with that. But even if we reduce consumption, we still need to integrate to the landscape and be a part of it. And in order to do that, we have to do a lot of unlearning and damage control from this legacy of, like you were talking about, like believing that there is a pristine wilderness that is absent of people. I mean, that is one of the most harmful, pervasive myths of conservation that could have ever been brought into existence.
Yeah, one thing that came up, I heard a story recently about the carbon trading, because climate change has been hijacked by the carbon conversation, whatever. So now there's people in Africa were being pushed out of these forests so that they could be bought by a company as a green capital. So that is going on. But the other thing about the purity thing that's been coming up, as I've been getting a little more involved in activism, is that using that one as a reason for protecting something is really troublesome. Like I've seen, the mining company CEO talk about how it's okay to come in and take out some of the last remaining intact sagebrush ecoregions, to start chopping it up, because it's not exactly pristine sagebrush land. Right. Because there's a few grass species in there from, the relationship layers of ranching or fire. And I see, people I really admire and who are wanting to protect these places, we're using that same language. And I don't think we understand what a disservice it is, because I think what it ends up leaving us with is then we have to prove why some place is special. Right. We have to scramble to find that rare plant, and that's the only reason, that's the only potential that's going to save something. If we can show that this is not soiled land already, because there's an emotional thing that happens when we're like, oh, it's already a disturbed environment, or, we stop caring as much culturally. We have a little bit of that. Oh, it's already kind of messed up. Like maybe that's a good place for it then. This is the idea of sacrifice zone. This is how they get us to let go of our attention to allow sacrifice zones still. Right. To fragment things into parcels of wilderness, sacrifice zones, and people living in concrete in the middle. Like it doesn't, we know it doesn't work, but we still have these emotional things that are making it hard for us to hold a different narrative. Which is like, if something has had a different kind of history where it's expressing different things, it's just like you or I having a story from our past that hurt us. There's a certain way in which we grow a little different. It doesn't mean there's something wrong and it's not worth it. It's like, I was telling Kollibri this morning that it's like, it's removing the ability to see things as sacred. It's like sacredness is a relationship. It's not this place can be sacred and this place never can. Right. It's how we're approaching and holding things. It's that relationship part again. So I've been seeing it as like a problem in protection efforts, Yeah.
Right. Because if we're looking for this purity as being, okay, that's why this place is worth saving, then all these places that aren't, quote, pure because they have because of they have deteriorated. There's tenant 2 or tenant 3 have an invasive species, and then now they're not worth saving. But unfortunately, what we're dealing with right now on a practical basis is the fact that most of the world is like this,
Right.
like
It has a trace.
there's, and working on this book that I'm working on, I saw one figure that under some ways of measuring what, undisturbed or pristine might mean, only 3% of the planet's surface at this point could be considered that,
I'm surprised it's that much.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But so I think this is the part that people don't understand too. And again, it gets back to this urban bias that you pointed out, so like people living in the city, not realizing that that's nature happening all around them. I'm right there with you with all the, urban ecology, right? And then two, not realizing how much of what is green is out once they leave the city is what the nature of that land is, so like, living in Oregon, for example, people would love to drive out to Oregon wine country and, it's so, it's so beautiful out here and so open and it's like, well, do you have, with no idea of how many chemicals are used, to keep it like that, chemicals that are so dangerous and toxic, they're not allowed to be used in the city even, just a real, and so into this vacuum of actual knowledge and actual experience, this ideal comes, or this ideology comes in and fills in that space. And so rather than going from actual knowledge or actual experience, it is just this idea that is based in an idealism and becomes dogmatic very quickly. And that, as you've been pointing out, here so well, it is going back to these, really nasty roots.
How is it any different to say that a region of where there's plants that are not from that place have moved in and done so-called damage, and so that therefore we can sacrifice that to build a big, a big power plant or dump some toxic waste there or whatever it is, put a pipeline through? How is that any different than what we already do with people, which is we put those zones wherever there are, poor communities or communities of color or indigenous communities, because we just don't care. Now, if you had a wealthy, community, you're not going to see that happen there, right? But it's not going to happen. So as much as I adore native plants, what we call native plants. And we can talk about, for sure, what does that even mean? Because the rhetoric and definitions of that are very slippery. But as much as I love the plants that are being, called native by conservation advocates, and I would love to see them proliferate and thrive, they are no more important than any other plant. I don't believe that they are. And we can talk about coevolutionary relationships, and that's usually the big argument for people that get upset when I talk about this and say, well, what about all of the relationships and things will just collapse? No, that stuff happens so fast. We are so again, we don't have the information that we think that we do. People think it takes millions of years for coevolutionary relationships to happen. It doesn't. It can happen in a few generations. We know this now. They've studied this with Darwin's finches. There's new Darwin's finches that occurred. I think it was in like less than, it was like 2 or 3 generations. And now they're going, oh, so maybe it doesn't take forever. So why are we so afraid? So if we know, if the science is pointing to the science that's done well, without bias, frequently is pointing to saying these plants are not, there's no moral application we can put, it's not like these plants are good and these plants are bad. Then why are we still doing that? And I think it does come down to this idea of purity, of like, why are we so afraid of plants and animals hybridizing with each other? Yeah. They're doing that of their own volition. You want to talk about wild or natural and those kind of ambiguous terms, but people that's pretty freaking wild. If an animal or a plant is saying I'm going to hybridize, and you have people who are saying we can't allow that to happen, and it does happen. I mean, like I still can't get over the barred owl situation in the Northwest, like literally shooting barred owls because they're hybridizing with, you know, their endangered owl species there. Like,
I had not heard that.
yeah, it just mind blowing to me.
Mhm.
And then, you know, so we're so terrified. I mean, that's miscegenation. That's exactly what that is.
Right.
We're terrified of this genetic mixing because then we won't have those pure species anymore.
Even in the scientific literature about this, you see them use terms like genetic pollution.
Right. Absolutely.
I was shocked the first time I saw that, because even before I'd heard your podcast with Kelly, and I saw that genetic pollution, I made the connection to eugenics, because I'm like, well, that's where that term comes from. I mean,
yeah. Well, we see, as far as the rhetoric goes, that it's identical. Like, if you were to lay out some statements, and some of them are from eugenicists about people from the 1920s, and some of them are from modern day conservation biologists or the media talking about these plants, and mix them all together, you wouldn't be able to figure out which is which. I mean, it's awful. So yeah, I think about what exactly, what actually is it that, why are we so afraid to allow hybridization to happen? Why are we so afraid to allow species to move around, and do what they're trying to, we're trying to preserve this wildness, this nature, as we've so described it, and then when nature and wildness happens, we're like, oh no, that can't happen. We need to maintain purity. And it's just like, I don't know where else that could possibly come from if it's not from this backwards mentality about, you know, basically racial purity, just apply it to plants. And like I said, given the fact that they're coming from the same root, it's like, it just makes so much sense to me. Yeah. So, and there's, I also think about too, like, so, the definition of native, right? So the definition of native, non-native, invasive, all of those words. When I see people trying to define them, and I see different examples of around different parts of the world, how they're defined, which oftentimes it's based on a timeline. It's based on if plants were here before such and such, before, before Columbus arrived, or, you know, in Britain, it's a slightly different timeline. It's similar, but it's like they have different words for before and after the glaciations of plants that were there, you know. Like their archaeophytes are the ones that I believe were there before the last glaciation. You know, so it's like trying to like put these things into boxes and determine whether they're native or non-native. When I read that information, it reads like reading, just like the way that these people who were trying to define race define things. It's just the same. It's like, we know race exists because we can measure it this way and this way and that way. And it was science, quote unquote, right? It was science that was being done, and they were taking, like I said, they were taking Darwinism, and they were taking, Gregor Mendel's theory of, laws of inheritance, and did all these different things. And they were saying, good science, we're gonna take this and we're gonna all combine all this information into this theory about, racial hygiene. And it worked. It convinced a lot of people for a number of years. And it's a direct parallel in my mind when I see people defending native versus non-native, because in order to do that, you have to throw out logic and reason about how ecologies form, about all these things we're talking about. You can't say that ecologies are dynamic and then say, but after 1492 they can't be dynamic anymore. So I think even that the rhetoric and terminology is very similar, as far as defining those terms, and then also seeing how the rhetoric changes. Like I know after 9/11, we started seeing plants are no longer just being termed as like, invasive aliens and things like that. Now they're actually terrorists, right?
Right.
And so we can see the rhetoric change, and the rhetoric is informed by the people who are having an emotional reaction to their society and the current events. It's the reason why Charles Elton and H.C. Hewitt developed the terminology to begin with, is because they were traumatized by the world wars. So we have a lot of untangling to do in regards to being really, really authentic and clear in the way that we're communicating, because it's just so biased. I don't know how we can call ourselves scientists and have such biased, emotionally charged language. And I'm all about being emotionally charged. I'm all about being,
Right.
in the moment and being passionate. But if we're going to talk about science, we need to let go of that. And
Right.
it's just not being done. You guys are very well aware of the hateful rhetoric that comes from invasion biology. And it's just the fact that it exists at all is testament to the fact that people are producing papers from emotion
It's
and
really
not from good science.
It's really gotten quite popular, like more and more popular. I see these different, people on the social media who have like 3,000 likes or something, and it's from them like hating a species and like calling it names and kicking it and stuff like that. And it's just like, wow, okay, that's all you have to do to get 3,000 likes and followers, and wow, this is scary.
Right.
And then the other thing that was occurring to me in your speaking there was that, like, remembering again, like, where this idea of purity came from was it's a curtain. There was other things socially that were going on to put this purity thing out there, to have the people starting to pay attention to that, instead of what's going on behind, which is reorganizing and taking charge of resources and disconnecting you from your own ability to be in a place.
Right.
So like the one that comes to mind for me is like the monstering of tamarisk. Like, that was originally started by a mining company, the Morenci mine in Arizona. They started that whole thing, and everybody still repeats it.
Right.
Because tamarisk comes up below the dams they put in to make it an open pit mine. So we took their language, and now we argue about that and spend billions of dollars spraying more poisons when they just get to open up another mine because we're distracted over there.
Right.
With this purity thing. Like, it's
eugenics was and is class warfare. So you have to always look, right, like you're saying, under the surface. And as far as invasive species, you hear this you always hear this, like, well, because the fear, right, just like the fear among in eugenics, the fear is that they're going to do damage. They're going to damage the ecosystem. They're displacing things. They're not being very well behaved. And it's confirmed for people because they see damaged ecosystems everywhere they look.
Right.
But we have to go back to the root. Like, like you're saying, like, what's underneath that? And it's frequently, it's pretty much always the fact that we have altered the ecosystem. We need to stop pretending that we're not the ones that are driving this whole thing. But at the same time, we need to stop self-flagellating and feeling bad, like we're bad humans, right? We need to find a space to move into where we can say, okay, like, we've caused some damage, the human race, primarily industry, we've caused some damage to the ecosystem, whatever ecosystem we're looking at, and some changes are occurring. Okay, and then what are we going to do about those changes? Are we going to freak out and start, applying morality, moral labels to things, or are we going to just say, okay, let's sit here and observe, and let's come back to what is actually happening, and what is at the root of what's actually happening, and what are the plants trying to teach us about what's happening in that environment?
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at kollibri.substack.com. That's kollibri.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.